The image is burned into the memory of a generation. A man, his face painted in the blue and white of his people, stands defiant on a London scaffold. He endures torture, refuses to beg for mercy, and with his last breath screams a single word that echoes through history: freedom. Then the axe falls. It is the heroic end of William Wallace, as portrayed in the blockbuster film Braveheart. It is a powerful, tragic, and inspiring moment of cinema. And it is a lie, a comforting, cinematic lie, designed to soften a truth so horrific, so systematically cruel, that it would be almost unwatchable on screen. The historical William Wallace was not granted the clean, swift mercy of a beheading. As a convicted traitor to the English crown, he was sentenced to the full, gruesome ritual of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. After being dragged by a horse through the streets of London, he was hanged by the neck, but cut down while he was still alive and gasping for air. He was then stripped naked and, before a jeering crowd, he was castrated. His abdomen was sliced open, and his entrails were pulled from his body and burned on a fire before his own eyes. Only then, after enduring this unimaginable agony, was his heart finally cut from his chest, and only after his death was his head severed from his body. This wasn't just an execution. It was a calculated act of state-sponsored terror, orchestrated by King Edward I to send a message to the entire nation of Scotland. So why did the movies spare us this reality? Why trade a terrifying truth for a noble fiction? The answer reveals a story far more complex than the one we saw on screen. If the film changed the very nature of his death, what else did it change? What other myths have we been led to believe about the man himself and the war he fought? This is the story of the hero of Hollywood versus the William Wallace of history, and how the truth is often more shocking and more fascinating than any legend. To build its epic hero, Hollywood began with a powerful and relatable idea: the common man. Rising up against the tyranny of the elite, the film gives us a simple farmer living a peaceful life, who is driven to rebellion only after his love is stolen and murdered by a cruel English lord. It's a classic underdog story, and it is almost entirely fabricated. The historical William Wallace was not a commoner. He was the son of a minor Scottish nobleman, likely Sir Alan Wallace of Ayrshire. He was a member of the gentry, the landowning class. This means he was almost certainly literate, likely speaking French and Latin in addition to his native tongue. He would have been trained in the arts of war from a young age in horsemanship and in wielding a sword, not a pitchfork. His rebellion was not that of a peasant who had nothing to lose. It was the calculated, violent response of an educated man from a disenfranchised noble family, whose country was under foreign occupation and whose own status and future were being crushed. The film's most powerful emotional catalyst, the jus prima noctis, or right of the first night, the supposed right of an English lord to sleep with a Scottish bride on her wedding night, is what ignites Wallace's personal war. It's a horrific and barbaric custom that makes the audience's blood boil. There is just one problem. There is absolutely no credible historical evidence that prima nocta ever existed as a formal, legal right in medieval Scotland or England. Most historians now view it as a piece of later folklore, a myth created to demonize the perceived injustices of the feudal system. It was a brilliant storytelling device for the film, providing a simple, personal motive for revenge. But it was not the cause of the Scottish Wars of Independence. The reality of his wife's death is far murkier. The historical record is thin, but it suggests Wallace was already a wanted outlaw. Before the famous incident in the town of Lanark, he and his men killed the English sheriff, William D. Heselrigg. While this may have been in revenge for the murder of a woman named Marion Braveheart, who may or may not have been his wife, it was undeniably an act of political insurrection by a man already at war with the English occupation. Finally, there is the iconic look, the flowing tartan kilts, and the blue face paint that have become synonymous with Scottish rebellion. The great kilt, or belted plaid, that Wallace and his men wear in the film would not become a common item of Highland dress for another 300 to 400 years. In the 13th century, Scottish warriors would have worn long linen shirts called leans, padded jackets, and chainmail, looking much more like their English adversaries than the film suggests. The blue woad face paint is an even greater leap back in time. This was a practice of the Picts, an ancient Celtic people of Scotland, who used it to terrify the Roman legions centuries earlier. By Wallace's time, the practice had been extinct for over 700 years. Showing Wallace with woad on his face is like showing a modern American soldier going into battle dressed as a Roman legionary. So why make these changes? Hollywood needed a simple hero with a clear motive and a memorable look. But the real William Wallace was not simple. He was a product of a violent and complex feudal world. And the war he fought was not for a Hollywood ideal, but for the brutal political reality of power, land, and national survival. Hollywood loves a spectacle. The film Braveheart delivers this with massive, sweeping battles where armies of thousands clash in dramatic, open-field confrontations. But the real war for Scottish independence was not fought like this. It was a conflict defined by cunning, terror, and mud. William Wallace was not a conventional general leading a conventional army. He was a master of what we would now call guerrilla warfare. His forces were often smaller, more agile, and made up of common men, not just nobles. They didn't seek glorious, set-piece battles. Instead, they would strike hard and fast at isolated English garrisons, ambushing supply convoys and patrols before melting back into the forests and highlands. He created a climate of constant fear for the English occupiers, bleeding them slowly, frustrating their larger, less mobile armies. The film also paints a clear moral picture of noble Scots fighting evil English. The reality of medieval warfare was uniformly brutal on all sides. After securing his initial victories, Wallace led a devastating raid deep into northern England. English chronicles from the time describe his army leaving a trail of utter destruction, burning towns, farms, and monasteries. They did not distinguish between soldiers and civilians. This wasn't a clean, heroic quest. It was total war, designed to cripple the English economy and terrorize its people, just as the English had terrorized Scotland. Nowhere is the difference between Hollywood fantasy and historical fact more clear than in the depiction of Wallace's greatest victory, the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The film shows a chaotic, open-field battle. The reality was a masterpiece of tactical discipline and patience. On September 11, 1297, a massive, heavily armored English army of knights and infantry faced a smaller Scottish force across the River Forth. The key to the entire battlefield was a single, narrow wooden bridge, only wide enough for two horsemen to ride abreast. The English commander, the Earl of Surrey, was so overconfident in his superior numbers that he dismissed advice to find a wider crossing point. He began sending his expensive, elite heavy cavalry across the narrow bridge from the high ground on the other side. Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew Murray, watched and waited. This was a battle of strategy, not passion. They held their spearmen back, allowing a significant portion of the English vanguard to cross and get trapped in the marshy ground on the Scottish side, unable to form a proper cavalry charge. When the trap was set, Wallace gave the signal. The Scottish spearmen rushed down the causeway to seize control of the bridgehead. The English knights who had already crossed were now completely cut off from the main army. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The English knights, weighed down by their heavy armor and bogged down in the mud, were systematically surrounded and killed by the disciplined Scottish. Schiltron's tight formations of men with long pikes. The main English army could only watch helplessly from the other side of the river as their elite vanguard was annihilated. The bridge itself reportedly collapsed under the weight of the panicked men trying to retreat. It was a complete, humiliating, and brilliant victory for the Scots, won not by brute force, but by tactical genius. This victory cemented Wallace's reputation as the guardian of Scotland, but it also ensured that he was now the most wanted man in the kingdom, hunted by a furious and vengeful King Edward I. After his defeat at the Battle of Falkirk, William Wallace was a fugitive for 7 years. He was a ghost haunting the English, engaging in diplomacy in France, and seeking support from the Pope. But in August 1305, he was finally betrayed by a Scottish knight, Sir John de Menteith, who handed him over to English soldiers. The guerrilla war was over. King Edward's propaganda war was about to begin. Wallace was transported to London, not for a negotiation, but for a meticulously staged show trial in Westminster Hall. He was not allowed to speak in his own defense or call witnesses. A list of his crimes, from murder and sacrilege to arson, was read aloud. He was mockingly crowned with a circlet of oak leaves to signify he was the king of the outlaws. But when he was formally charged with high treason against King Edward, Wallace spoke his final, defiant words. He admitted to all the other crimes to being a robber, a murderer, and an enemy of the English king. But to the charge of treason, he famously retorted, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. It was the last free act of a man who knew he was already dead." The verdict, of course, was a foregone conclusion. He was sentenced to death in the most horrific manner prescribed by English law for traitors. What followed on August 23, 1305, was not simple butchery. It was a carefully crafted piece of political theater, a gruesome public service announcement from King Edward. Every step of the process was designed to send a specific, terrifying message. First was the humiliation. Wallace was stripped down to his undergarments, his hands tied behind his back, and bound to a wooden hurdle. He was then dragged by horses for 6 miles through the rough, filth-strewn streets of London. From the Tower to the execution site at Smithfield, this was meant to strip him of his status as a knight and a hero, to reduce him to common carrion in the eyes of the thousands who lined the streets. Second was the criminalization. At Smithfield, before a jeering crowd, he was hanged from a tall gallows, but this was not the final act. The hangman was unexpert. Wallace was cut down, while still alive, semi-conscious and gasping for breath. The message: you will not receive the honorable death of a beheaded nobleman, but the shameful death of a common thief. Third was the ultimate violation. While still alive, he was pinned to a wooden table. An executioner took a knife and publicly castrated him, a symbolic punishment for having sired treason. Then, as the crowd watched, his abdomen was sliced open, his internal organs, his intestines, liver, lungs, and heart were pulled from his body and burned in a brazier before his own eyes. This was the core of the horror. The message from the state was absolute. We own you, inside and out. We have the power to literally unmake you as a man. Finally, after he had died from shock and massive blood loss, came the warning. His lifeless body was beheaded, and his corpse was hacked into for pieces. This was the quartering. King Edward had not just killed his greatest enemy. He had used Wallace's body as a political billboard. His preserved head was dipped in tar and placed on a pike above London Bridge. A grisly welcome to all who entered the city. His severed limbs were sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom, to the major towns of Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth to be displayed publicly. Edward believed he had created a warning that would terrify the Scots into submission forever. But in his meticulous cruelty, he had made a terrible miscalculation. He had not created a warning. He had forged a martyr. Having given William Wallace a more heroic death, Hollywood needed to give him a more romantic legacy. And it did so with a final, breathtaking lie that completely rewrites royal history. In the film, Wallace has a secret affair with Princess Isabella of France, the wife of the English prince, Edward. She falls in love with him, warns him of traps, and is ultimately revealed to be pregnant with his child, ensuring that Wallace's bloodline will one day sit on the English throne. This is pure, unadulterated fantasy. The historical Isabella of France was in her home country for the entirety of Wallace's rebellion. More importantly, at the time of Wallace's death in 1305, she was only 9 years old. The affair was not just improbable, it was impossible. The film also does a great disservice to the man who actually won Scotland's freedom, Robert the Bruce. He is portrayed as a weak, indecisive nobleman who repeatedly betrays Wallace before finally being inspired to fight. The real Robert the Bruce was a far more complex, cunning, and ruthless political operator. He was no simple hero. For years, he played both sides, switching his allegiance between the Scots and the English whenever it suited his own powerful claim to the Scottish throne. But it was Bruce who possessed the royal blood and political savvy to ultimately unite the nation. Shortly after Wallace's death, Bruce murdered his chief rival for the throne inside a church. had himself crowned King of Scots, and then renewed the war for independence with a brutal single-mindedness. He had learned from Wallace's martyrdom that there could be no compromise with King Edward. And this is the final great irony. King Edward's meticulously cruel execution was meant to be an ending. Instead, it was a beginning. The sight of Wallace's severed limbs, displayed in towns across Scotland, did not inspire the terror Edward had intended. It inspired a burning rage. Wallace the man was dead, but Wallace the symbol, the martyr for Scotland, was now more powerful than ever. It was Robert the Bruce who harnessed that rage, 9 years after Wallace's execution. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Bruce led a Scottish army to a decisive, nation-defining victory over a much larger English force, finally securing the independence that Wallace had fought and died for. Hollywood gave Wallace a fictional child and a quick death. History gave him something far more powerful, a horrific martyrdom that transformed him into an immortal legend. In the end, King Edward won the battle for Wallace's body, but he spectacularly lost the war for Scotland's soul. Does a crime of this magnitude demand a punishment of equal cruelty? Or is that simply a justification for the state to indulge in its own form of monstrosity? Draw your line in the sand. In the comments, and if you seek stories that challenge the foundations of history, subscribe and activate notifications.